Welcome to the Menlo Midweek podcast, everybody. My name is Mark.
My name is Jessica.
And Phil's back with us.
Hey, everybody. I'm back. Made it back.
Guess who's back?
Congrats. You're back.
Don't call it a comeback.
Don't call it a comeback.
Okay.
Well, the space looks a little different.
It does. It looks awesome.
Yes.
Yep.
And we're glad to have our first midweek with Phil in this new podcast 2.0 space.
I think this is our first midweek.
It might be our first midweek. Yeah, we have recorded some stuff that hasn't come out yet.
Yes.
Spoiler alert.
Ooh.
That will be coming soon. But yeah, this is our first midweek in the new space.
Yeah.
And it is it needs a little bit more, but for now, it's a great starting point.
It's great. It's great.
Speaking of starting point.
Hey.
Just kidding.
Nice. Phil, how's your time away?
It was great. We did kind of two trips.
Okay.
I went with a group of pastors that I've done now for the last 5 years to Montana, and it's a thing called the Refuge, and we just fly fish for a week, and
Amazing.
Very restorative. There's really no responsibilities. They kind of know that for pastors, it's hard to not work, and so they build the experience. So basically, you're not allowed to. So that's really relaxing for me. I actually didn't go on the water one day and just kind of did some personal care work, which was great.
Cool.
And then came back, and then as a family, we went to Maui, our first time anywhere in Hawaii together or separately. And that was tons of fun. Not as relaxing because we had 4 kids with us, and one of them as well, who's 4. But it was still really fun. Had a great time. Got back kind of last week, and then I was doing prep and doing some stuff from home. But this is my first week kind of back in the office, going full speed. So glad to be back.
What was harder, the taking care of 4 kids for a week or not working for a couple days at the retreat?
Yeah, I mean, I think so the first year that I went to the Refuge, I taught the following weekend, and I was still sort of touching base with work. It was a unique situation. I was serving on the board of a church network, and that board was going to review the Refuge as a possible place to take lead pastors in the network.
Got it.
And so in my head, I went into that week thinking this is a work trip. And I'm evaluating, and so I didn't do all the things that, candidly, they told you to do, but I was like, And so it was probably the Wednesday of that first week where I was like, I've done this dramatically wrong. And so then when I got to go back the next year, I was able to disconnect more. And so now 5 years in, I feel like even my body is actually kind of ready for it. So I don't schedule myself to teach the next week. I remove email, and we use a thing called Teams on our staff. I remove that. So, if you have my cell phone number, you could get a hold of me. But a lot of days when I'm fishing, I don't even have my phone on me, which, if you know me, is pretty wild.
Yeah.
I heard Rick Warren years and years ago in kind of a small gathering. He talked about this rhythm that he had in ministry. He's at, and kind of Rick, he's like, I got this from Jesus, that he's like, I divert daily, which I had a framework for. Like, here's how I spend time with God every day. I withdraw weekly. I had a rhythm for that too. And then he said, I abandon annually. And he talked about kind of a week long where he just disconnected. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. And so then I did the Refuge, and I was like, this is what that means. And so, so that part for me now, 5 years in, is actually not difficult. It's really helpful. And shout out to Loren, who helps on our team, does a bunch of administrative support for me. When I came back, it was not like a, absolutely horrific hellscape of email. And so lots of the things that needed to get handed off or handled did. So, it was good. And then kid stuff, I talked about it a little bit this weekend. You're just kind of constantly managing kids. And so if there are pockets of rest that you get, great. But that's kind of a fringe benefit.
Yeah.
So,
What was your favorite part of the Maui trip?
We went to, we stopped at Costco on our way from the airport and got a bunch of stuff so that probably 2 out of the 3 meals of the day we were having at this condo that was Airbnb. But then we would just go to nice little places as a family, kind of late afternoon, usually for early dinner. And we had some special times that were fun and felt very like Maui. And then one of the nights that we were there, we did a sunset cruise, just out. And that was lovely. Wells was in the throes of a cold, and so he just wasn't feeling good. So he was like either laying across Alyssa's lap or laying across my lap. But that was like the most peaceful, beautiful. Where we were in Maui was Lahaina, and so it was very touristy. And so there's part of that you kind of know what you're in for. But being on that sunset cruise was the time that it really felt the most like, I bet if you dropped somebody here 100 years ago, it felt exactly this way. Like you're on this beautiful water. You're looking at a shore that's just distant enough that you can't make out anything on it. You're just, the level of appreciation in that moment was crazy. So that was pretty special. That's probably my favorite time.
Yeah.
And that's your first time in Hawaii.
Yep.
What did it meet expectations?
Yeah.
Exceed? I mean, it has a lot of hype. Us West Coasters here that grew up here, like Hawaii was always the spot that was like,
Well,
we can escape. We
not
need to
for
go to
me,
Hawaii. That's true, not for you. But I feel like
If you
East
had the
Coast
money
goes
for
to
it,
the,
yeah.
like the Keys or
Yeah.
somewhere else. So
Yeah, I really liked it. Alyssa and I joked around at the end that it needs to be a trip that Alyssa and I take just the two of us.
yep,
Because I think there are a lot of things that when you have 4 kids and your youngest is 4, your limiting factor is it's like we can do whatever a 4-year-old can do. And so even stuff like snorkeling or just some of the more like as the kids got older, or if it was just us that we would want to do to kind of drain out the day, we just couldn't do any of that. So we know folks that when they've done stuff like that, they've taken someone with them that like kind of can watch their kids and do some of that. It's not really our vibe. So it just meant that we were, full-time mom and dad, which is totally fine. But I think probably it was awesome. But I think probably the miss was there were plenty of times that we were like, oh, we'd love to eat at that restaurant. We'd love to go stop by there. We'd love to sit here for a while.
yeah.
And then you've got a 4-year-old that's like, sugar. So it's just,
Shave ice.
yeah, that's 100% true. And one time he woke up really early. And, there's a time difference.
Yeah.
It was one of our first days. He woke up really early. And so by like 2 p.m, he was just completely uncorked. I mean, not a functional human being. And so you're trying to help the other 3 kids still have a good day and navigate him. And that part was a trip. So we did it. We did it. Made it back.
I like how you talked about that difference in your message about the trip versus the vacation. We've been using that language a lot as well in our house. I'm like, was this a trip or was this a vacation?
Yeah.
So that was helpful framework.
Yeah. Well, and what's hard is like I got to have a vacation the week before, like when I left, and Alyssa didn't. So she went from being a single mom for a week with our kids while I was away to then going on that trip. So she really wanted to do the trip. I don't feel terrible about that. And the refuge has stuff for either spouses or women in ministry that they do also. And so Alyssa's been to a couple of those, and she did one of those earlier this year. So I felt like at this point we're both in on the importance of that, but like Alyssa may give you a different answer if you asked her.
That's awesome. And then, I mean, that was last week. And then you said that you didn't really want to line up teaching, but then we found you teaching up there this past weekend. So how did that happen?
Well, so it was actually, it's been 3 weeks. So week 1 was Montana. Week 2 was Hawaii.
Nice.
We got back last like Monday night, Tuesday morning. And so I felt like I had enough margin, and it was my first couple weeks out of teaching since I've been at Menlo. And, I think maybe for some people that's normal. And I think for me, I just knew that there was probably a significance to me trying to be back. So
And you're back.
Here I am. And nobody wanted to preach this week. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is quite the topic to jump right back into.
Cheryl made that comment last week. She's like, this one was hard, but I don't want the next one.
Yep. Well, knowing you, Phil, you probably chose this and brought this on yourself.
I did.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
So we're talking about war, battles, all of that, why it happened, some justifications or different perspectives on it. There was a lot in this message, and this is one of those ones where as I was hosting online, I was like, this has a chance of just going over super well, or just got to kind of put on my armor and get ready for all the fun stuff that's going to come in this week.
Sure.
So how did you prep for that, and what was your mindset going into teaching on something that is very, very challenging?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of what we tried to do with this series was look at what objections people have, right? Like, what are those things that we look at and kind of go, that's weird, And some of them, Noah's Ark, Jonah. Some of them are these individual punctuated stories that we go, that's weird. Like, I don't know if I
Right.
can believe that. That's weird. But then there are, like this week, or this last week around war and violence, originally I was looking at it specifically through the lens of Joshua 6 and the walls of Jericho, and kind of like, do we narrow it to one specific story? And as I started to just do the work of reading some books and listening to some stuff and digging into the text, it was like, man, yes, that's an example of this, but it's just an example. This is a bigger conversation. And so then it was sort of zooming out and asking, what are those things if we talk about the kind of violence, conflict, these things that we would say, those are atrocities, particularly the ones that it looks like God prescribes.
Right. Right.
How do we reconcile that? And, my core framework is that we can take the Bible seriously, and that there have been thoughtful men and women for millennia who have brought intellectually honest and rigorous study to all of these. And so, I think once I aimed out to that level and it became more thematic, then I think it sort of shaped, okay, so how do we talk about this? Why would God work this way at all? What are some of the views about that at a macro level? What's the overall story of Scripture, and how do we understand these things inside of this bigger plan? And then, if the gospel is the whole reason why God would work this way in humanity, we better make sure we land there. So
Yeah. And you started with not all wars are created equal. I thought that was really interesting, just to acknowledge that sometimes, yes, we can see maybe that was, however you want to say that, justifiable, but in other cases, that just feels so unfair.
right.
And so why did you think it was important to start that way?
Well, I think the difference in Scripture between descriptive and prescriptive, I talked about, a lot of this comes down to the way we experience how God's revealed himself in the New Testament versus the Hebrew Scriptures, or what we often call the Old Testament. That contrast is by design. Like, it's a different narrative form, and the way that God is showing up in human history has a different function, right? Like, God is not trying to protect or preserve the church, capital C, in the same way that he was trying to preserve and protect Israel as a nation through the Old Testament. And so because of that, when we read, especially the Old Testament, it's very easy for us to bring New Testament lenses where almost everything that we read in the New Testament is either prescriptive, telling us the way it ought to be, or very quickly calling out the difference between the real and ideal. Whereas in the Old Testament, it doesn't work that way. The Old Testament is much more, hey, we're trying to give you, in many cases, a record, like a historic record of the story of God's people and God's faithfulness to Israel. And so because of that, identifying the difference between, hey, when Saul chose to do this, when David chose to do this, when Solomon has this many wives, the Old Testament is not condoning that. It's not saying, like, that's a good idea. It's just saying, this is what actually happened. It's oftentimes already shared the ideal, then it's showing you the real, then it's showing you the consequences of the gap. That's oftentimes the pattern, and helping people to understand the difference between, there are really hard things that are tough to make sense of about how God shows up, but then there are other things that we shouldn't ascribe to God saying, do it this way, just because people did it that way.
So for those that might be wanting to dive into this further, and this might be the first time, or they've put it off until now, of really going back and looking at the Old Testament, how can you help people bring that lens of not New Testament lens but Old Testament lens? Because that's just such a foreign concept for a lot of us to read the same book, the same papers that are together. One chapter is old and one chapter is new, and that's the page break. But the framework in which it exists is completely different.
Right.
So how can we help coach those to read these portions of the Bible as they were ought to be read?
Yeah, so there's a great book called How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. I think it's co-authored, but one of the authors is Gordon Fee. and it does a great job of talking about a little bit of what we did this weekend, which is what is the macro story of the Bible? And I summarize that kind of as like if there was a table of contents to human history, it would be creation, fall, redemption, restoration.
Yeah.
And so understanding if you bring sort of that lens to the way we read and study the Bible, you can start to see how it fits together. Joshua is not a comprehensive story of God's involvement in humanity. It's one section of one section of the story of God's involvement to humanity. And then it also talks about what are the different literary genres. And I also think it does a good job of, I think church is by and large designed for us to learn how to read and study the Bible, which is awesome. We should totally do that. But the Bible also describes itself as a two-edged sword, that it's actually doing work inside of us. I've heard it described that as we're reading the Bible, it's reading us. And that book, How to Study the Bible for All It's Worth, or How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth by Gordon Fee, he does a good job of trying to break down in what ways am I exposing myself to the spiritual work of the text reading me, not just the other way around. Because when all we're concerned about is reading the Bible didactically and taking from it what we can, I think it very quickly paints a pretty cynical and judgmental and critical spirit for us to bring. Do I believe that? Is that good? You know, for a long time, over the last 30 years, culture asked the question of the Bible, is it true? I think by and large, the cultural answer to that question is, well, like, of course not. Like, that's not even close to true. And now the cultural lens, especially with Gen Z, is not, is the Bible true? That question is almost irrelevant to them. The question now is it good? Like, morally good? And so I think that dynamic between me reading the Bible and the Bible reading me can help break that down.
Yeah.
So that'd be an easy next step.
Perfect.
And it's a very readable book.
Okay, good. And there's also two other books that you mentioned. We had some questions about those as well. Could you go into a little bit more about how they're helpful and what lens we should approach those?
Yeah, so Nonviolence, The Revolutionary Way of Jesus by Preston Sprinkle is a really helpful book. It's written in a super readable way. And Preston literally takes it like story by story and will talk about, here's some views, here's different ways that people take this. And again, I've said this so many times, the foundation of our faith is not your view of a particular story in the Old Testament. The foundation of our faith in Jesus, shockingly, is Jesus. His life, his death, his burial, his resurrection, that these are actual historic events that have secured salvation for humanity. And so I think he does a great job of centering the primary understanding of our faith around that. And then understanding, hey, this is all figure outable. Like we can do work on this stuff. It doesn't need to be, I think a lot of us, our faith, if we grew up in church, in flannel graph world, our faith got built like a house of cards. And so it felt like every way we learned all of these stories was just another card and another card and another card. And if the way that I learned that changes, the entire house has to fall apart. And that's foreign, candidly, that's foreign to the Bible. If you sit in a rabbinical school, even today, let alone 2,000 years ago, and you talk to a rabbi, they're demanding that you ask questions. They're asking questions like, what about this passage offends you? What about this passage makes you angry, right? Like, in Sunday school for us, it would have been like, you're excused. You know, like those those are very foreign for us as like kind of Westerners. But I think they're very helpful as adults coming back to faith. You know, I think I'm tinkering with a talk for a couple weeks to finish the series really around kind of deconversion. And I think one of the calls that I think the Lord has placed on this generation is how do we help how do we challenge people to go from deconversion to reconversion? And this, not that people could lose their salvation, because I don't think that's possible, but this idea of like, what does it mean to reconstitute my faith to the foundation it should have always had? Because I think what deconversion often represents is that a false foundation is seen to be false. And I would often agree with that. And so it's not that you shouldn't have a faith, it's that our faith needs to be in the person and work of Jesus. And then everything else flows from it rather than the other way around. And then the other book, Crucifixion of the Warrior God, is actually a very academic. It's 2 books. It's an academic series written by a guy named Gregory Boyd. That would be like if you got through Nonviolence and you're kind of still looking, and you go, I'm in academia, or I'm, somebody that I read Tim Keller quite a bit, and it's, kind of child's play for me, no big deal, then Gregory Boyd would be sort of up your alley as here's a easy kind of next deepening conversation and in some of the most current scholarship around this stuff. So
That's great. Great. And then we got further along in your message, and you kind of poked at the question of why. Why does this happen? Why does God allow this, or however you want to frame that? And there are 3 points that you made: that God uses everything, that salvation isn't fair, and that judgment isn't ours. How did you arrive at those?
Yeah, I mean, I think that oftentimes I'm trying to think through, like, what are the objections that we bring to the text, myself included, to be honest. Like, we all, I think, have this, which is, I want this to go a certain way. And I think that we can read some of these stories and go, oh my gosh, let's just not look at that anymore. And I don't want that to be a part of the story.
Right.
But as I mentioned, like, if this stuff didn't happen, we're not Christians. Like, the prophecies made about the Messiah aren't fulfilled. And so, we can abstract those things, and we can say, well, God could have done it another way. And he absolutely could have, which is why I started with that text in Isaiah, where Isaiah gives a voice to God in the first person. My ways are not your ways. And so God's doing it a way that's not mine. And he really can and does use everything. And I think that the text we take out of context to say that is Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans that I have for you, declares the Lord. That's actually not for us. We can talk about that on another podcast. I went to Romans 8, which actually is for Christians, right? God uses everything, right? All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And so trying to help people understand, and this is all about how do I pull the text into your timeline right now, because not only can God use these things we're talking about from the Old Testament, he can use the hardest stuff in your life, right? I talked to somebody after a service this weekend, married 58 years. This last week, he put his wife in memory care. And I'm praying with them, and he's crying, I'm crying. This is awful, like an awful week. And so I'm aware that when I say God uses everything, he's hearing me. And he's having to ask the question personally, do I believe this? Do I believe that God's going to use this in my life? And I think when we see these stories that feel so otherworldly, if we can go, God, I see how you used this thing that makes no sense to me over the span of human history. If you can do that, I can trust you with this. I think that's a direct export of these stories. And then I think, just theologically, I think that a lot of people think they're saved because they were smart enough to figure it out, because they were good enough for it to work out. It has something to do intrinsically with them. When the text of Scripture says the opposite over and over and over and over again, we've been saved by grace through faith, not as a result of our works. And then if you were wondering, Paul says, if you're wondering, it's so that nobody can boast, right? Text in 1 Corinthians, God uses the foolish of this world to confound the wise. So if you go, oh man, God picked me, I must be awesome. The text actually kind of says the opposite. and out of that should create in us like this deep level of humility. And so when we go, well, why did God pick this group of people and not pick this group of people? Because God's will is perfect and ours isn't. And we go, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Yeah, I get it. I wouldn't have either. And I'm not God. Like and so, and then I think I always try to ring that bell of judgment. I talked about that text in 1 Corinthians where Paul says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. And I think we flip it a lot as Christians. And so we're really pumped to judge the next cancel culture company or the celebrity we don't like that doesn't even claim to be a Christian. Well, our own life or the life of someone we really care about that's a follower of Jesus that is way outside the will of God for their life, we're like, well, I'm gonna create some, I don't want to judge that person. And the text says, no. We are to bear one another's burdens. We are to hold one another accountable. We are to extol one another to the will and call of God for our lives. Well, at the same time, we are loving our neighbor as ourselves and letting God bring conviction to that. That's the New Testament model of judgment. And so this idea of like, God, I wouldn't have judged the world the way you did. God's like, well, good news, not your job. And so I think my hope is, just like in the story of that gentleman, that we can take those lessons from this theme and then apply those back into our daily life today. So
You just said so much.
I know, sorry.
No, it's good. It's really good. My mind went through, and you kind of answered this as you were talking, but I think it would be good to double click on it. If I'm entering into a conversation with someone and the war thing comes up, how could a good God let this happen? Phil, the challenger, might be like, yes, this is my time. Mark is like, oh no, what do I
Oh,
say?
sorry, my
what
mom's
can
calling.
I do?
Bye.
So for those that might be entering into conversations like that,
Yep.
how can a quote unquote a good God allow, war or prescribe war, as you talked about? How does that fit and stay within the character of him? Again, you kind of already answered this, but I think it'd be good repeating.
Yeah, I think that at a certain point, we need to be honest about our own inherent tension as well. So if somebody goes, hey, I have a really hard time, oftentimes this objection is going to come from somebody who either doesn't have faith or doesn't have faith anymore, right? They would say, I used to be a Christian,
Right.
but then all these stories, that I learned as a kid, I started looking closer, and it was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe in a God that functions this way. And I think it's okay to say, you know what, can I be honest with you? I struggle with those stories too. I think that we are oftentimes trying to maintain a faith without tension. Like that's a goal in our mind in the West of like, how do we have a view of God and a pursuit of Jesus that requires no personal tension between how I think and feel and how God reveals himself. And so what happens is we lie. That's the byproduct. Because all of us actually do have a tension, but we just feel like we're God's PR department. And so we're like, I have to communicate this to the person that brings this objection up in a way that I have no tension over. But I think you can say, I struggle with that too. If I was God, I would have done it differently as well. But can I tell you why I have hope in the middle of this? For me, even as I investigate all of these things, and there's a whole bunch of people that think a whole bunch of different things about the stories we're talking about right now, the foundation of my faith is on the fact that Jesus actually lived 2,000 years ago, actually died, and actually came back from the grave. And so he made a way for me to know God forever. And my faith is really built on that as a foundation. And then everything else sort of gets to flow from that. And there are people that have great work around this, and I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But I think at the core of it, I don't feel like I'm having to defend. Being a Christian for me is not primarily about defending the historicity of the Old Testament war nature of God. I don't feel like that's my apologetic cross to bear. And I think if I had to give somebody sort of my 1 or 2 sentence, like say you do all that and they're like, cool, but what about? I think my 1 or 2 sentences, it's easy for us to assume that God should work. I think I referenced Tim Mackey, for God to work like the UN and do it our way today. But in order to preserve Israel from within which Jesus would be born, in order for that to happen, God had to deal in the reality of the day, which included war and violence at a scale we have never seen before. And so while it doesn't make any sense to us today, if you do the work, I think you'll discover that if God didn't do it that way, Israel would have ceased to exist. Now, we can quibble about individual stories and all that, totally get it, and let's do it. But at a macro level, in order for Israel to survive, God could not function as though he was the 21st century American God, because that's not the moment we were in the middle of. Like, God related differently to the world because it was different. So I think foundation of Jesus, lots of people have talked about it. God needed to preserve Israel in a pre-law tribalistic moment that if he wasn't willing to deal harshly, Israel either would have ceased to exist or would have lost all impact, right? You see that over and over again where something feels harsh to us. One of the reasons that I think God often showed up in pretty drastic ways was because God knew the influence that other religious traditions would have on it. It would have been so easy for their tradition, for their pursuit of Yahweh, for their unique expression of that to go up in smoke.
Cool.
Neat.
But I gave, like if those are helpful, I gave kind of 4 views, and maybe some of these are helpful for you. Right? We talked about historical fiction, that some people see these stories almost as mythological, like they're not written to be literal. Some people see it as sort of the cultural language of the day, like God spoke in violence because that's all culture would have understood. The one that I think is really beyond dispute, at least at some level, is this idea of relative mercy. That when we read a passage, I referenced it this weekend, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. When we read that with 21st century lenses, we say, oh my gosh, that's so brutal. But it was actually written as a merciful law to say the punishment should fit the crime, because outside of that law, like what other cultures and nations had, was brutally different. Like it was way worse. So what we read as, God, how could you, was actually merciful by contrast. And then kind of the final one, right? God said it, that settles it. I'll live with a level of cognitive dissonance where this feels really hard, so I just won't look at it. And so I think understanding that, just like everything else we've looked at this summer, there is a version of understanding these stories that's different. Like we can understand them differently and still be faithfully following Jesus. Now it reflects a hermeneutic we need to be careful of, but I just want to make sure that it's not like, well, Phil said I have to believe that it happened this way, and if I don't, then I can't be a Christian. Remember, that's that house of cards thing. The foundation of our faith is actually the person and work of Jesus, and then the rest of this gets built around that. But I do think one of the challenges of how we think about the Old Testament is the way that Jesus speaks about the Old Testament.
Right.
Jesus seems to take these as literal events. And so I think that is tricky. Jesus understands the Old Testament to be historical in nature based on the way he describes it. I think that's one of those. And there are people that hold to these other views that have answers to that, but I just think it's an objection you have to work through.
Yeah. I for sure spent the first 30-something years of my life in that last category of the cognitive dissonance. And yeah, it was just like, what's the other phrase I'm trying to think of? Ignorance is bliss.
Sure.
Like just gloss over it. You just inherently trust the Bible. Don't ask questions, kind of thing. And I think part of that excuse for me, and I'm sharing this because maybe someone else will feel that same way, was I never considered myself like a smart person. I never considered myself someone who I just didn't like school. I didn't like studying, all of that stuff. And so when it came to Bible study stuff too, it was very easy for me to be like, well, I just don't understand. So I just like trust that God knows what he's doing. And I just trust that. And it's so easy to just get in that little box and think that it's all okay. And I think for my life, whatever, that was fine. But as like, a 30-something adult, I'm like, no, there's so much more to that, and just really relearning and trying to grow up with my faith now a little bit, and just like, wow, I used excuse after excuse not to try to understand this a little bit deeper, not to fight against it, not to all of those things. And yet there's still so much beauty in the Old Testament that we just completely gloss over sometimes. So yeah, I think it's just, this has been such a cool series for me. And I really like this talk. I was quiet this whole podcast because I was just like, I don't even know how to like ingest all of this, but it's been really powerful. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. I think, one of the things that we'll talk about in a couple weeks, because it's like we've been having a conversation about faith deconstruction all summer. That's what this series is really about. And, one of the things that I think is tricky is I think like when I was growing up in high school, this will connect in a minute, kids that wanted to be different were all like, hey, we're going to be goth. That was like the thing, right?
Yeah.
And what they didn't notice was that they were all different together, which is not different, right? Like you're just like a whole goth group. And you're like, we're so edgy and different. Like
to dance under underpasses.
Yeah. And so I would argue there's some social gatherings that are kind of like that today too. But I think that sometimes what we're watching in deconstruction is folks that take this kind of all or nothing, I'll just believe my pastor, I'll believe that Sunday school teacher, I'll believe my youth pastor, to the T, I just won't ask harder questions. Like that's the way this is going to work. And then it really just takes one college professor or one YouTube video or one podcast or one book. And without realizing it, what we can do is we trade one single voice, single perspective for another single voice, single perspective. And the truth is always more complex than that, right? But when somebody goes, hey, those people that aren't, that don't believe like I believe, they're crazy liberals, we're making one mistake. But then I think, without realizing it, sometimes in the spot of deconstruction, we go, oh, look at all those crazy fundamentalist, stupid people. We're the smart ones. And it's like, oh, no. Like, it's way more complex than this. And I think as our faith matures, I'm reading through a couple books right now, and one of them is called After Doubt. I'll probably quote it in a couple weeks. It's written by a professor up in Portland, and he talked about like what we call deconstruction today. For 2,000 years, the church has called spiritual maturity. Like that's what it is, right? Like it's just formation.
Yeah.
Now, because we're obsessed with identity politics, and because identity is the new idolatry, we run towards a label. And so now deconstruction means like I can't be a Christian anymore. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about reminding people that the foundation of our faith really has got to be the person and work of Jesus. And the thing that I think is so helpful in this conversation when people go, where do you get that? Well, the early church didn't have ta Biblia, right? What we think of as the Bible did not get recognized for hundreds of years. So they had stories about Jesus that they heard orally through tradition. They had maybe some letters if they happened to be at a church like Corinth or in a region like Galatia, and they had the Old Testament. That was it. And so this idea of, well, you have to understand the Bible this way and see all of it this way as a precursor to becoming a Christian, I would just say, don't tell the first century church that, or the second century, or the third century. And it doesn't mean, like, I take very traditional conservative views on a whole lot of this stuff, not because I haven't explored it, but that's where convictionally I've come to. But it came through time and discovery and work, and I can recognize that somebody that takes a position that's different than mine is not just a closed-off fundamentalist or a crazy left-leaning liberal. I can recognize, hey, if we at Common have like these core things together of who Jesus is and what it means to follow him, the rest of this stuff can be different. That's okay. And so, we all have different definitions of what it's okay to be different and what's okay to not. But the idea that we all have to believe exactly the same way about all of this, like, we know that's not true. But I think we just have to give each other permission for that sort of work. And I think, I think that the idea of war and conflict and how God shows up in the Old Testament, I think I said it this weekend, that if you don't have any tension in how God shows up that way, if it's just like not a problem for you, I would say that is a problem. Like, these are people that we believe were created in the image of God with infinite dignity, value, and worth. And several times it looks like a whole lot of them went away. And how do you deal with a God who says, I'm not willing that any would perish, but that all would come to know me, and that? Like, how do you reconcile that? And if you haven't done that work to at least start that conversation, and I think it's an onion, right? Like, I think we're dealing with that over the course of our entire lives. And I think if somebody brings this up to you as an objection, more than any answer you can give, letting them know the inherent tension that you have in the same thing and the foundation you find in the person and work of Jesus will probably go much further than any sort of academic debate you can have about a specific instance of violence in the Old Testament.
That's good. I'd like to give a little bit more space before you wrap up to this. You've mentioned it a few times, this idea of God being your idealistic view of God versus the God that he has prescribed or described himself as being.
Here's that Keller quote, right? If the God you worship never disagrees with you,
Yep.
you don't worship the God of the Bible. You worship the God of your own imagination.
Yeah. I've noticed a theme. This will pop up in your messages maybe once a month or so. There'll be something along those lines. So that's on your heart.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's really easy for my preferences to be the things that shape God, right? And so I'm not asking the question, God, who are you, and how do I submit to who you are? It's almost like we're we're bringing, okay, God, I would be comfortable with you being like this. This is how I want you to be. And oftentimes that's like a God that's informed by our politics a lot of times if we're adults, or maybe it's informed by our friend group, or maybe it's informed by the media that we consume. Maybe it's informed by the faith tradition we grew up in. But we have sort of this, in like Bible study nomenclature, we would use the term presupposition, right? We bring all these presuppositions, or if you're not a Christian, you'd use the word bias, right? Like all this bias that we bring. And so when we read a story, we go, well, it can't be this. Like that's the way we read it, right? It can't be this because of all these presuppositions. And I think some of it is just naming what are those presuppositions. I had a professor in college, and first day of class, he went to 1 Timothy 3. And he challenged all of us in class. He said, the sentence was, women should learn in all submission and obedience, I believe was the sentence. This is the first thing we did as a class. He's like, all right, I want you to break up. All the groups were co-ed. I want you to break up and tell me what was surprising about that line 2,000 years ago. And so we all take our best crack at it. I was probably a sophomore. I might have been 19. And he didn't even ask us for our answers. He's like, can I tell you what would have been the most surprising? And he just underlined, women should learn. It's like, that would have been the most. Let me tell you the circumstances that we were in the middle of. And let me tell you why that would have been the most countercultural phrase in that sentence and actually in that chapter. And he tried to peel back, right? Because we had all these biases and presuppositions that we were bringing to the text as 21st century Western readers. And he was like, oh, that's not the way that works at all, you know? And so I think a lot of this is just about doing the work. And some of your bias and presupposition may be correct, but unless you examine the text in its context, oftentimes it's called authorial intent. What did that author mean to say to that group? Unless we do that, we often can't clearly see the forest through the trees. We're so wound up in what we say God must be like or God can't be like. And I think you are creating your own house of cards if you say God must be like or God can't be like, if it's not rooted in deep spiritual formation work. Because if you go, hey, there are ways that God has shown up, right? Like one of the ways that I think is really important in our moment is the text of Hebrews says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's very different, right? We have a God who is shown up in different ways, but he's the same God. His character is consistent. When we think about religions like Islam, they have a God who is progressing. He is different. And that's on purpose. That's not a problem. If you look at Mormonism, right, as another religion that is not a Christian religion, I'll let that controversy just sit out there for a minute.
How dare you?
But they would say God can be different in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine of Covenants because God is consistently different. And that's not a problem for them. But I would say, no. Something that like a presupposition I bring to the text is Genesis 1 God and Revelation 20 God are the same God. He's consistent. And that story, right, of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, that's been the plan. That book was written before the fall of humanity. God knew that Adam and Eve would eat the fruit. That was a part of his plan. He didn't want death, destruction, damnation coming into the story, but he knew it would. And for the ultimate plan of restoration of all things, relationship with his creation that's unbroken because it's not related to our work, is connected to his finished work. That was always the plan. And even the messy, hard stuff that he allowed was so that that plan could come to pass.
My brain is so tired, but I loved that so much. Tired because it was trying to take all of it in.
Well, you know, it's 3 weeks of not being on the podcast with you.
I know. Okay, I have one last question that might open a can of worms. But as I'm listening to this, my mind went to, man, there's so much work that you have done that I have not. And there's so much work that I probably should do. And because I like to learn and investigate, that comes naturally to me. But for those that might not want to do the work, might not want to peel back onion layers, or I need to investigate this topic, or I'm reading this scripture, through how I think it is, and I don't want to go any further than that. What happens? Why? I don't know what question there is behind that, but there's a question there that I'm trying to tease at, or a point that I'm trying to tease at, which is, when is enough? Maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's different for everybody, right? I think that we're in a cultural moment where these conversations are more prominent and more pronounced. There's a quote in that book I'm reading, After Doubt. I'm trying to remember the quote. It's something to the effect of, in the West, we feel like there's this crisis of belief happening, and it looks like everybody we turn to is deconstructing their faith and falling away. It feels like it's everywhere. It feels like it's just this losing battle. What's the church going to be? And he talks about how if you take it from a global perspective, for every one person somewhere in the process of deconstruction in America, there are 5 passionate followers of Jesus meeting him every day. Like, that's the ratio, because the church is exploding around the world. And so I think there's something to this idea of at some point we have to realize that enough has to be enough, right? Like, at some point I have to come to grips with the fact I'm not going to understand everything. Now, I think there's a big difference between Jesus, I'm in and I want to continue to learn more, versus Jesus, I need to learn more before I'm in. I think that's way different.
Interesting.
And so if you're somebody that says, hey, I'm not sure I'm in yet, I would just say keep exploring. Like, cool, that's awesome. Like, I got good news for you. You're actually not even theologically pursuing God. He's pursuing you. You didn't love him first. He loved you first. Like millennia ago, the Bible says that before the foundations of the world, he knew your name and he was pursuing you. So I think that's one. And then I also think that there's oftentimes you don't need, if this is not a tension you feel, you're probably still not listening to this podcast. You probably turned it off a while ago. But if you feel this tension, I would just say tease out the tension that you feel. There are good conversations for everything you wrestle with. And if you don't feel it today, maybe put a pin in it. And it may not be this conversation. It may be some other conversation of faith. For some people, it's around the sexual ethic of Jesus in our cultural moment, right? They go, oh my gosh, well, great news. There's some really good, thoughtful conversation around that subject that's pursuable. It's knowable. And so I think for people to be able to dig into these conversations when they're ready and when they feel necessary is really important. Obviously, I'm a nerd, and so this stuff is really exciting to me, and I've wanted to learn it and will keep working to learn it. But not everybody, like for some people, these are not big tensions for them. And I don't think it makes you a second-class Christian to not dig through this stuff. I think usually where it will show up for you is either someone you love who goes through a process of deconstruction or is trying to investigate faith, and these come up as objections for them. And out of love for them, you'll pursue maybe a more nuanced understanding of these conversations. Or a crisis will happen in your life, and the vision you had for God will be challenged by the version of life you experience. Usually it's one of those two things that will, that onion in your life, it will start to peel back, right? The book of Philippians says that God is faithful. He will finish the work that he started in you until the day of Christ Jesus. That this idea, Romans 8, right after the text we were in this weekend, Paul talks about sort of the process that those God foreknew, he justified, those he justified, he sanctified, those he sanctified, he glorified. We call it kind of the highway of salvation. There is no off-ramp. Like the faith development that God is doing in us, we want to pursue it wholeheartedly, but a loving God will not allow your faith to stagnate. One way or another, he's going to challenge us to go deeper in our faith.
That's great. Thanks.
Of course.
Cool.
Yeah.
Jess, anything?
No.
Your brain just kind of melted?
Yeah, as you were explaining that, I was like, what kind of put me on this journey of, we'll say, spiritual formation? And I think it was similarly, like you said, I had some friends who were starting to question things or even just like posting things on Instagram that I was like, okay, I thought we believed the same thing, but you're posting something different. And I want to talk about that. And so through those communities and those people, that's where I kind of started being like, okay, so you're reading these things and you're seeing these things and all of that. And that makes more sense to me than the God that I grew up knowing. And so I want to learn more about that God because that sounds better. And so that's kind of what kickstarted my, like, you know, spiritual formation for the last couple years or so. But I think that's just like a really powerful way to look at it, you know, just thinking like you may not feel the need to dive deeper or the need to study or the need to whatever, but hopefully in some way, shape, or form, something will happen where you'll just be like, oh, okay, I need to do some work on this.
And I would say, you know, again, my caution for folks that are in this process is we have built a faith tradition oftentimes on the shoulders of a perceived all-knowing tribe. That's what we've done. So these are the people we listen to. These are the books that we read. Here's the voices that we trust. And everyone outside of that all-knowing tribe is the devil. Like that's, we don't say it that way, but that's sort of oftentimes the crisis of faith that we believe that's part of that house of cards. And I would just caution folks that if you're going through this, be alert of your tendency to trade one all-knowing tribe for another all-knowing tribe. And that may be the all-knowing tribe of your Sunday school teacher to the all-knowing tribe of that podcast, that social media account, whatever. But again, just understand this all-knowing tribe probably didn't have it all right. This all-knowing tribe, just shockingly, may not all have it right as well. And I think we are often setting ourselves up for another fall. And you can watch this actually. You know, I'm about to turn 40. I would say I've watched this happen at every stage of my faith development where I watch my peers who are really connected to the all-knowing tribe idea, where they just let's call it 2 to 3 years, they go, that tribe was totally wrong. I found a new tribe. And they don't see it. They're having a hard time understanding because they're just in the water of it. But it's all-knowing tribe to all-knowing tribe to all-knowing tribe to all-knowing tribe. And it's like, well, maybe there's nuance to some of this. And then in faith, here's the hard part. Maybe there's some of this we will never understand. Like maybe there's some of this that there's a gap between my perceived reality and the God of reality. Like maybe that exists. And I think that does exist. So, but I think extend grace to yourself. If you go, hey, I'm just exhausted trying to get my kids up every day, get them to school, figure out work, try to pay my bills. I'm just thankful that God exists and is somebody that allows me to talk to him and has secured salvation someday and an abundant life today. I'm in. Fantastic. But I hope that conversations like these this summer let you know that when and if you get to a place where this layer of your faith development onion gets peeled back, you understand that underneath it is not a take it or leave it all-knowing tribe view, but that there is a discussion in most of these conversations. So
that's great. Well, thanks for coming back.
Of course. Thanks for having me back.
I know it's hard to do after Maui.
In the new studio. I love what I get to do. So usually when I'm gone for a while, I come back energized. I get in trouble because I usually come back with some ideas. So I'm pumped to see what happened. And shout out to these guys. If you're looking at the studio, you don't know it, but this is a part of like a big project with a whole bunch of stuff that's come in. And so it's super fun to be gone and come back and see what the Lord's done in people. And it's a good reminder that Menlo Church is not Phil EuBank, never has been, never will be. And, God's been faithful to this place for 150 years. So for me being gone for a couple weeks, my wife reminds me it's not going to fall apart. So.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for listening, watching. Text us if you need anything, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.